Hello and welcome to the next of our lecture recaps. This is a recap of our lecture on internal controls. So what relevance does internal controls have here? Well, remember under corporate governance rules and due to accountability, the directors are responsible for internal controls. They're also responsible for setting up an audit committee, which we're going to look at. They're also responsible for risk management within the entity, which means that we'll have controls over the risks that we'll identify during our risk management process. So what this means is that we have to take a risk-based approach to internal controls. So we have to tie the internal controls in with our business objectives, with the key risks that the business faces. The controls then need to be put in place and we need to get feedback on those controls. So do remember that internal controls are required under corporate governance and the directors are responsible for internal controls under corporate governance rules. So to have internal controls, we'll need to have a system. Why do we need a system of internal controls? Well, because first of all, we want to prevent fraud and error. We also want to ensure that accuracy is maintained throughout the system. We need to make sure that we safeguard our assets so that none of the assets go missing, for example. And we need to make sure that information is generated within the firm. And we're going to look at what type of information we need later on. So the objectives of an internal control system are, first of all, effective and efficient operations. So that's the first thing we want from our internal controls. But we also want that to lead to reliable financial reporting. So that's going to give us the accurate information that we need. Ultimately, it's to do with compliance with laws and regulations to make sure that we do that and to make sure that all laws and regulations are adhered to. There are, however, some limitations that you need to be aware of on internal controls. For example, they're designed for routine transactions, not for one-offs. So if you have one-off transactions, they may slip through the net on internal controls. You may be limited in the amount of resources you can put towards your internal controls. Remember, they'll need to be cost beneficial. And controls can be circumvented. That means that people can get around them, for example, through collusion with each other. Lastly, human error. The controls rely on the people that implement them. If those people don't do that correctly, well then the controls may fail. So the key to having a good system of internal control is to first of all relate it to risk management. So we relate our internal controls to our risk management because remember, the internal controls have to be related and risk-based. So the three principles for a good system are: number one, we need to embed the system in the organisation so that everybody is aware of the internal controls and everyone applies them. It has to be able to respond to risks, and we'll look in detail at risk management later, and that will show how all of the internal controls need to try to control the risks that they're involved with. And there needs to be procedures to report weaknesses in internal controls so that we don't have just weak internal controls that are not rectified. So when it comes to the roles within the firm, well, the CEO's role will be to set the tone in the organisation for internal control. They will establish integrity and ethics within the firm. The board's responsibility will be to set the policies and procedures on internal control to ensure that they are adequate and, of course, to provide resources so that they're implemented. The risk committee, which we'll meet in detail later, sets the strategy for risk management. And senior management then provide the information to the board. They will also be responsible for monitoring the internal control system. Internal audit, who we'll look at in detail in the next few lectures, will they evaluate and report on internal controls. And the employees, will they act within the system and ensure that any weaknesses are reported to the senior management. So remember that internal controls will need to respond to our risk management, and we looked at an interesting scenario on that in illustration 1. Remember then we related this to our Sarbanes-Oxley because Sarbanes-Oxley was one of our corporate governance codes in the US that give legal responsibility for internal controls to various aspects. For example, management. Management were legally responsible for evaluating any weaknesses in internal controls and for an annual report on internal controls. When it came to the auditor, remember the auditor had to give an opinion on internal controls, not just on the financial statements. So when we have an internal control system, it needs to be reviewed and monitored. So this needs to be done annually, and management are responsible for doing this, and they review it in the annual report. So the 5 elements that they're looking for a good internal control system will be a strong control environment, which is the tone set at the top of the organisation, the philosophy or style of the organisation, and can be determined by the organisational structure. Bureaucratic structures tend to have a strong control environment with lots of controls. They'll also look at the risk assessment process. They'll look at whether we're identifying internal and external factors, and whether we're also considering controllable and uncontrollable risks. They'll be looking for control activities within the organisation, such as segregation of duties, training and HR, arithmetical checks, physical controls over assets, authorisation, supervision, and remember, supervision is so important we put it in here twice. There must be supervision within the organisation. Then information and communication, well, that means that there should be information and communication about internal controls within the organisation. So we need to gather the information and communicate that information. Lastly, monitoring is all important when it comes to internal controls. Remember that this internal control system is there to generate information. We need that information to perform the daily tasks within the firm. Also to monitor the performance of the internal controls and ultimately to make decisions. So there'll be different types of information required within the firm, and it will depend on the management level what information is needed. At a strategic level, as for example the board, well, they will need lots of different information. They'll need to understand all parts of the organisation. When it comes to the tactical level, the senior managers, well, they need current data to identify trends and make decisions based on that. At an operational level, well, we simply need simple data there to understand what's happening at a transactional level within the organisation. So all information that's generated by our system must be accurate. So that is accurate, complete, cost beneficial, user targeted, relevant, authoritative, timely, and easy to use. So remember that by accurate, so ACCURATE. So the last bit we looked at here was getting that information and what system we had to do it. So an EIS, remember, is an executive information system. So this covers the whole business in real time. So that's the one that the board will use to get that wide range of data. A management information system, well, this is something that converts data into information so that management can understand it better. A decision support system is something where we can actually put information in and make decisions to try and say, well, what if this happens? What will the effect be? For example, a spreadsheet. A TPS is our transactional processing system that captures the data initially. For example, in the retail sector, that will be the till system where all of the sales are recorded. So that was a recap of our lecture on internal controls.